This video is sponsored by Captaincon. More about Captaincon and its awesome 3 days of gaming later in the video. What's up, folks? Welcome back to Tactical Tortoise. My name is Trevi, and today we're going to be talking about some Warhammer 40k tactics. This time, covering some secondary objectives. Now, if you like Warhammer 40k tactics, and especially obnoxiously deep dives into tactical subjects in Warhammer 40k, I have the Advanced Tactics series currently going on over on the YouTube channel membership and on Patreon and patreon.com/tacticaltortoise. The only reason I bring it up, I mean literally the only reason, is that I just talked about the most improved GT2021 secondaries and the differences between GT2020 and GT2021 in a recent video. That's sort of what spurred the creation of this video. So if you want to really deep dive into some really crunchy topics in 40k, highly recommend you go check those out. And I really appreciate everyone who joins the Advanced Tactics series. Now anyway, today we're going to be talking about the GT 2021 secondaries and talking about the best ones and the worst ones that you should take or avoid when you are getting into your GT 2021 games. Now, this isn't just going to be a tier list. What I'm going to do is talk about the best and worst secondaries in each category, then rank the few best ones and the few worst ones in the game. We'll also cover mission-specific secondaries as well, and I'll talk about a couple that you should be trying to take or that you should maybe be trying to avoid. First off, let's get some general concepts out of the way for people who maybe aren't so familiar with secondaries. All of the secondaries that I'm talking about today are out of the GT 2021 packet, and we're going to be talking about them specifically in context of 2,000-point Strike Force games. When you get to a game, especially GT 2021, you are going to pick 3 secondaries. The secondaries are broken down into categories, those being Battlefield Supremacy, No Mercy, Shadow Ops, Purge, Warpcraft, and mission-specific. Each mission will have one mission-specific objective that you can take as one of your 3 out of that mission that doesn't fall into any of the other categories. From each category, you can select one secondary objective, and oftentimes your faction will have access to several faction-specific secondary objectives that will also fall into those categories. You can take one faction-specific secondary from each book you have access to. For example, a Space Marine chapter could take one faction-specific secondary out of the Space Marine Codex and one out of their chapter supplement, assuming that they meet the category requirements for all of those secondaries that you take. Now, most people refer to secondaries by 2 categories: maneuver focused and attrition or kill focused. That just depends on how they're scored. Maneuver focused secondaries tend to require you to stand in a particular place of the table. Attrition or kill focused secondaries score you points based on killing enemy models. Maneuver focused secondaries tend to score more highly depending on the mission and terrain combination. Attrition or kill focused secondaries are often scored differently depending on your opponent's composition. That makes the maneuver secondaries a little bit more concrete and you can build your army around, but that's not necessarily 100% untrue for attrition or kill focused secondaries. As a rule, you should be looking to score at least 10 victory points from each of your secondaries, although obviously more is preferred. Any army list you build should also have at least 2 secondaries that you can easily score based on how you design the army. Secondaries like Retrieve Octarius data, Engage on all fronts, or To the Last can be accounted for in your army build. Then you can pick the other secondaries based on the table, mission, or your opponent's list. Basic stuff out of the way. Let's talk about the best and worst secondaries in GT 2021. First off, I'm going to be going through all of the categories and talking about the best one and the worst one, I think, in each of those categories, starting with Battlefield Supremacy. In perfect fairness, all of the objectives in Battlefield Supremacy are pretty good. For the worst one here, I picked Behind Enemy Lines, although that's not even that bad. It does just require you to get all the way to your opponent's deployment zone, and that's sometimes pretty tough. If you can't do that consistently with multiple units, you won't score too many VPs on this mission. But being a maneuver-style secondary, it is pretty consistent because all you have to do is just stand in a place and you get points automatically. Don't even have to roll any dice, which is pretty nice. The best secondary is Engage on all fronts. This one is easy for just about every army to score. If you're bringing some fast units, and especially if you're a fast and or aggressive army, you can score this one 15 points pretty easily, assuming you don't get blown off the table very early. The third one in the category, Stranglehold, is actually still good. It's good on 5 objective missions and sometimes on 6 objective missions in very specific criteria. It is just a little bit less consistent than Engage on all fronts. Moving on to No Mercy. This one is another tough one. The worst one I picked is Grind Them Down. This one is almost always a trap since your opponent has control over your scoring. It's much better if you go second because you can see how many units your opponent kills during their turn, and then you can try to beat them in order to score that grind them down. But obviously you pick secondaries before you know who's going first or second, which means that sometimes you can end up going first, and then your opponent has that control over how many units are destroyed. This one sometimes is good, but very often backfires on the person taking it. I picked for the best secondary here, no prisoners. This one is very mission specific depending on your opponent's list. It's especially good if your opponent has a lot of models that meet the criteria to score off of them, so non-monster vehicle or character models. If they do, this secondary is like a free roll. Because 40k is mostly about killing your opponent's stuff so that they can't stand on objectives to score points, you're going to be killing a lot of your opponent's frontline infantry anyway. So if they have a lot of them and you can score VPs doing that, it means that you can score without having to actually change your game plan, which is really where you want to be with a secondary objective. That said, if your opponent doesn't have probably at least 120-ish wounds of those category of models, this secondary is not super good. To the Last is the third one in this category and is another really good one. The big downside is that it requires you to keep your most expensive units alive, which means that typically your most powerful pieces you have to play very cagey with in order to stop yourself from losing points on this secondary. So it's not for every list, but a lot of lists can make good use of that one. Moving on to Shadow Ops, this one's a little bit interesting because Shadow Ops has kind of been the focal point of the GT missions so far in the edition. For the worst secondary, I picked Investigate Signal. Games Workshop promised a rework to this secondary in GT2021 coming from GT2020, and they didn't really do that. It requires that the unit performing the action be wholly within 6 inches of the center of the table with no enemies present, which is a really awkward game state to try to finagle. Your opponent has control over whether or not you're able to complete it, and it's just not a space where units normally sit. And for only 3 victory points a turn, you're better with almost any of the other secondaries in this category. For the best one, I have Raise the Banners High. This one's especially good if you have access to 3 banners near your table edge, or you have fast units that can put banners out in the center that your opponent can't easily get to break. If you can put 3 banners down on turn 1 and your opponent isn't able to break them, you can easily score 15 points on this secondary without really having to try. That said, it does require you to have a lot of infantry in your army, and it's not great for every mission. Some missions only have 1 or 2 objectives near your deployment zone, and the rest of the objectives are easily accessible by your opponent, which means that the secondary is not really going to do you much good. Missions like Retrieval Mission and Overrun, however, have a lot of objectives in your deployment zone, and Raise the Banners High is straight money. Now, I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about Retrieve Octarius data in this category. It's usually the one that's fighting with Raise the Banners High. Raise the Banners High is generally more consistent than Retrieve Octarius data because you have to move across the table pretty aggressively in order to score it fully. But that said, in missions where you don't have easy access to objectives to put banners on, Retrieve Octarius data is often a pretty solid pick. It does require you to kind of build your army around it, though, because you do need to have some models who can move across the table aggressively to get into your opponent's table quarters to retrieve that data. Moving on to Purge the Enemy. This one is mostly about killing specific types of enemy units. And for the worst one here, I've picked Titan Hunter. In the change to GT2021, this one scores basically nothing if you're killing only 1 or 2 Titans in your opponent's list, meaning it's only good in matchups where your opponent has 3 or more Super Heavies. And even then, destroying 3 or more Super Heavies before the end of the game is very difficult in order to score a reasonable number of points off of it. Previously, you could take it if your opponent only had 1, and you could score 10 points, I believe it was the number, which was fine. But now you only score 4 if you destroy a single Super Heavy, which means almost never worth it. A lot of the lists that bring multiple Super Heavies will also have other stuff you can score kill-focused secondaries off of. And Titans will generally also give up Bring It Down, one of the other secondaries in this category anyway, almost at the same rate that they give up Titan Hunter. So, like, literally there's only one specific instance in which you would take Titan Hunter, which is against a triple Titan list as long as you're assured you can destroy all 3, which is a tall ask to begin with. The best is Assassination. Most armies in 40k will bring 3 or more characters, and because Assassination now gives you a point if you destroy the enemy warlord, as long as you can kill all of those 3 characters, it baselines out at 10 points, which is very nice. You do have to be confident that you can kill those characters, but if you are, you can net yourself an easy 10 or even greater VP secondary without really having to change your game plan at all. Moving on to the final category for the standard secondaries in GT2021. We have Warpcraft, and this is a little bit of a weird category. Basically, all of the Warpcraft secondaries deal with psychers, and they require psychic actions, which are sort of a whole deal. Certainly the worst one in the category is Pierce the Veil, which scores you potentially 8 or 15 victory points, depending on how many times you complete the action, but requires you to complete an action within 6 inches of your opponent's battlefield edge. That's pretty tough. Psychic actions innately already come with a little bit of inconsistency. Not only do you have to roll out a psychic test to complete them, usually it's warp charge 3 or 4, so it's basically not double ones to complete, but still there's that 1 in 36 chance you could just flub it and blow yourself up. And your opponent can also deny them with stratagems or just their own psychers, which means that even if you roll low and get those psychic actions off, if your opponent has any psychic defense, they can just stop you. This means that if your opponent has any defensive psychic abilities whatsoever, Warpcraft secondaries are a little bit tough to pick, and that's made even worse if your opponent doesn't have any psychers, because we'll talk about the number 1 in the category, Abhor the Witch. This one is only selectable if you don't have any psychers, but if you don't, you get an incredibly powerful secondary to fight against psycher-heavy armies. You get 3 victory points for each psycher character you destroy, and 2 victory points for each enemy psycher unit you destroy. So those would be things like Grey Knight units or Thousand Suns who have psychers in them, but aren't necessarily characters themselves. This means that against armies that are really relying on psychers to do a bunch of stuff, you can often pick the secondary and just really screw them for taking those psychic units. None of the other psychic actions are really worth talking about. Warp Ritual is okay, but requires you to be within 6 inches of the center of the table. And Psychic Interrogation is also okay, but requires you to have line of sight to an enemy character, which is not often the case, since especially as soon as you're going to take that secondary, your opponent's going to run away and hide. So the psychic action secondaries are generally best left alone, and unfortunately, taking psychers in your army, especially a lot of psychers, open you up, be abhorred the witched against. And with that, we've talked about all of the secondaries for each of the categories. Now, before we move on to ranking the best and worst in the game out of these categories, let's go ahead and talk about our sponsor, Captaincon. Captaincon is 3 days of basically the best tabletop gaming you can find, located in the picturesque Warwick, Rhode Island, and being hosted on February 4th through 6th. 2022 will be Captaincon's 7th year running. This is a holistic gaming convention that services games and players of all types, from the game that I'm sure you're interested in, Warhammer 40k, to also large events for War Machine and Hordes, Infinity, Dust Tactics, A Song of Ice and Fire, like basically all the miniatures games, as well as an enormous and comprehensive board game library, so you can get your board game on when you're done smashing people. They've also got a big ol' Warhammer 40k ITC scored GT. Here's some pictures of me playing in the 2020 40k GT. It was super fun. Look at that sick and competitively appropriate terrain. Haha! Captaincon has been a big part of my life since its inception. I've been to every single one, and I've loved every minute of it. Here's some pictures of my peeps and I demoing Breachstorm when we did that. They also have this cool thing called the Captain's Log, where you get like little Chuck E. Cheese points for playing in different events, and then you can like redeem them for prizes and everything. It's super cool. The hotel room block and badge sales for Captaincon 2022 are open now. Early event sign up starts right now, September 1st. So get on over to CaptainCon.com to register your ticket. Again, February 4th through 6th, 2022 is when the event's happening, and there are going to be so many frickin' tournaments at this thing. Anyway, now to our regularly scheduled Warhamster 40k talk. Now let's move on to the best and worst secondaries in the game out of these standard secondary categories. So what I've done is I've picked the 3 best and the 3 worst out of the ones we just talked about. Now, starting with the worst secondaries in the game, I've picked, in order from best to worst, I guess, Titan Hunter, Pierce the Veil, and Investigate Sites. For all the reasons we talked about before, Titan Hunter is relatively inconsistent. It scores you between 4 to 6 victory points for killing a Titanic model, but the situations in which you would take them are very few and far between. Not to mention the fact that oftentimes your list will have other things to do if you are playing against an enemy list that has a lot of Titans in it. For example, Titans are usually not very good at contesting table space or objectives, so oftentimes you can do things like score engage on all fronts, raise the banners high, or retrieve Octarius data against them without having to really spec your secondary picks into attacking them. If you are confident you can kill the Titans, your opponent can also potentially play KG and deny you a ton of points, since often Titans are to the lasted, which means your opponent is incentivized to to keep them alive, and that could be like a 10-point swing for each Titan that you randomly don't kill, which is potentially game-ending. There are certainly situations in which you'd use it, which is why it's not lower on the list, but generally speaking, if you see Titans across the table, you shouldn't immediately run out to grab Titan Hunter. Definitely consider your other options beforehand. Next up, we have Pierce the Veil. This one is very difficult for all the reasons I talked about before. It's a psychic action, which means you're giving up psychic powers to do it. The positional requirement is ridiculously restrictive, within 6 inches of your opponent's battlefield edge and more than 6 inches from enemy models. It's insane. That said, it does score a lot. If you can do it 4 times, you do max it out, which is super difficult. I'm not really sure if any psychers are going to reliably be able to do that, but sometimes you can strategic reserve somebody in or deep strike somebody in within 6 inches of your opponent's battlefield edge, perform that action 4 times, and then just be done with it. That's so unlikely, though, because your opponent may be able to deny you or just kill that character who's popping up in that really exposed area. There are essentially no circumstances in which I would consider this psychic action. It's very bad. Last, but certainly least, Investigate Signal is the last one. This one is low scoring and ridiculously difficult, since your opponent is able to contest it, and you have to perform the action wholly within 6 inches of the center of the battlefield, where there is typically very little terrain to hide yourself behind, and you're in the greatest danger. Your opponent can also just put stuff there, and then you're not even able to start the action, and you have to do it all 5 rounds in order to max the secondary. Especially compared to the other Shadow Operation secondaries, which typically score much more consistently. This one is just flat terrible. But now, let's move on to some of the best ones. Moving from worst up to best, we have Raise the Banners High. This one isn't good in every single situation. Again, you're really only looking for situations where you have 3 objectives that you have easy access to in order to put those banners on turn 1. But if you're in those situations, Raise the Banners High is a very consistent, very easy secondary. You just have to basically remember to put your banners up and don't run your OBSEC off the objective so that your opponent can grab it from you. If you do those things, you're in for an easy 10 or 15 points by the end of the game, and that's pretty nice. Moving up, we have No Prisoners. Like I mentioned before, this is another one that is only good in specific situations, but in the situations where you can take it, it is so good. One thing to keep in mind about No Prisoners is that if your opponent regenerates wounds, they will actually potentially count for No Prisoners multiple times. So if you're playing against units like Poxwalkers or Necrons with a high model or wounds count that then respawn themselves, it's important to keep track of every time you kill one of those models and they respawn, because at the end of the game, you're going to score additional points for killing the models multiple times. This can make it so powerful in these matchups where your opponent has a lot of wounds on the table and you're going to be attacking them anyway in order to remove them from their objectives, which means you're basically just getting free money. So situations where your opponents have a spam of beasts or swarms or infantry or models that regenerate, I would certainly consider taking No Prisoners. Again, it's not good in every situation, but if you can get 11 or 12 points on this, I would take it almost every time because it doesn't really require you to change your game plan at all in order to score it. And lastly, let's talk about the best secondary in GT 2021. That's going to be Engage in All Fronts. This one is mostly in here for its consistency. You don't really have to do anything special to engage in all fronts. You just have to run into a table quarter, not be within 6 inches of the center of the table. If you can run into a single table quarter with a single unit and you have your own 2 home table quarters locked down, then you score 2 points at the end of your turn. That's it. You're doing it. If you do that 5 turns, that's 10 points, and that's what you should be looking for to score in a secondary. That said, if you're aggressive and if you have a lot of deep strikers and fast units, you can potentially score 3 points a turn and max the secondary out very easily. Engage in All Fronts is a perfect example of a secondary you can build your list around and put a couple of fast-moving units to score it on turn 1 or turn 2 before your army is able to get to those positions. If you do that, you're in for a consistent secondary that you can kind of lock into your game plan, and then look for other secondaries to take elsewhere. Definitely one of the most commonly picked secondaries in the format, and one that you're going to see an absolute ton because, again, it's super duper consistent. And with that, let's move on to some mission-specific secondaries. Now, like I said before, these are basically a category all their own. Each mission only has one, so you only have one to pick from, but they don't fall into any of the existing categories, which means you can take them alongside any other combination of secondaries out of the packet. Now, I'm going to talk about the 3 best and 3 worst mission-specific secondaries and some other ones that you can take a look at. Generally speaking, what you're looking for are secondaries that don't really require you to change your game plan, very much like if you were picking normal secondaries, but also secondaries that are easy to score. Secondaries that have actions that can be performed by any unit, for example, are pretty good because you can use a particularly tanky or kind of inconsequential units to perform them, or secondaries that score at the end of your turn because then your opponent doesn't have any ability to try to contest you. So with that, let's talk about some of the worst secondaries in the packet from best to worst. First off, we have Overrun from the ostensibly named Overrun mission. This one gives you points at the end of your command phase, so at the start of your turn, if you control objective markers on your opponent's side of the table. This is so difficult. Overrun is a pretty split 6 objective mission with 3 objectives on each player's side of the table, which means the objectives are relatively far away from each other and in easy striking distance of your opponent's army. And because the objective scores in your command phase, you have to get to the objective, then hold it for an entire round in order to score 2 victory points. It goes up pretty quickly if you control 2 or 3, but that generally becomes a very much of a win more scenario, where if you're already killing your opponent 15-0 on primaries, you could also max the secondary, but do you really need to max the secondary if you're doing that? If you're in a losing position, you will never score any points in the secondary. It's basically worthless. And it requires you to play ludicrously aggressively in order to score it, and gives your opponent the ability to contest it. You'll sense sort of a theme here as we move on to Surround Them from Surround and Destroy. This one has basically the same criteria, although it's a little tougher, actually, because there are 2 objectives in your deployment zone, and you have to be holding both of them in order to score the secondary, and 1 or both of the objectives in your opponent's deployment zone. Now, in fairness, it does score a lot. You get 4 victory points if you hold one of the objectives in your opponent's deployment zone, or 8 if you hold all 4 deployment zone objectives. But again, if you're holding all 4 objectives in deployment zones, you've basically won the game already. You don't need to score 8 points on a secondary objective because you could have picked any other secondary and have maxed it out by now. 4 victory points at the start of your turn for holding 3 of the most difficult to hold objectives on the table is a tall ask. And especially since, again, your opponent has the ability to try to contest you or destroy your units on those objectives, I really don't see this scoring almost at all. And that moves us on to the worst secondary objective, at least in the mission-specific category, although this one also might be the worst secondary objective in the game. I think it is, actually. Let's just go ahead and say it. Raise from the Scorched Earth mission is the worst secondary in 40k. First off, you can't max the secondary. You can only get 12 points. It's not the worst. The same is true for secondaries like Retrieve Octarius Data, so it's probably fine. But not being able to get 15 victory points for the ridiculously difficult gymnastics you have to do to score this secondary is kind of tough. It requires you to perform the Raise Objective Special Action, which is a whole paragraph of text by itself. This is an action that can be performed at the start of your movement phase, so before any of your units move in your opponent's deployment zone, with no enemy units also in range of that objective marker. This is at the start of your turn, remember. So if you are setting up to score this, your opponent has already had a full turn to try to contest you or kill your unit. You then perform the action, which ends at the end of your turn, meaning that unit's taking the entire turn off, and as long as it's still there at the end of the turn, the objective is raised, you get 6 victory points, and the objective is removed from the table. So not only do you have to already have been there at the start of your turn, meaning it basically takes 2 full rounds to complete this special action, because you have to move up and take the objective, then sit on it for an entire turn to remove it. But once you've removed it, you also don't get any victory points for it. You can no longer hold that primary objective because it's removed from the table. In fairness, if you've had the opportunity in a 5-round game of 40k to sit on one of your opponent's objectives for an entire round, you probably are okay on primary objective points, but you also would probably be fine with any other secondary objective besides this raise action. In order to get 12 points for it, you have to do this to both of your opponent's objectives. And, this is the kicker, you can't do them multiple times in the same turn. So even if you table your opponent, it still takes 2 full rounds to raise both objectives. Ridiculous. This objective is ludicrously difficult to score and definitely not worth taking in any circumstance. Now, the same cannot be said for the best mission-specific secondaries that we have in the packet. I do have a couple honorable mentions here, those being the Action Secondaries, Strategic Scan from the Scouring, and Data Intercept from Vital Intelligence. The big deal with these secondaries is that they can be completed by any unit. They are action-specific secondaries, and they do take a full round to complete, but you can do them with swarms or characters or vehicles even, which makes them relatively easy to score, unlike a lot of the other Shadow Operation secondaries, which do require infantry units. They don't tend to score very highly, and they typically favor the player going first. They're a little bit difficult to do for the second player since they take an entire round and your opponent gets essentially 2 turns to kill the units threatening to perform the actions. But they are relatively consistent. You can usually score a couple points in a tight mission where you're not sure if you can take any other secondaries. Moving on, let's talk about the top 3. And bottom up, we have Vital Ground. This is from the Battle Lines mission. And although it does score in your command phase, so at the start of your turn, it isn't quite as difficult as some of the other ones that we've talked about. This one scores you points just for holding objectives outside your deployment zone. And in this mission, there are 4 objectives, 3 of which are outside your deployment zone and are relatively far away from each other, meaning that it's relatively consistent to grab one objective and hold it down for as long as possible. This can potentially force your opponent to try to react to you in order to block your vital ground, which can make them overextend. And if you're dominating the middle of the table and can play aggressively, you can rack up points on the secondary very quickly. It's not the best secondary, but it is a solid pick if you don't feel like you have any other good selections. Moving on, we have Direct Assault from Sweep and Clear. This scores you 3 victory points if you hold a center objective. It's a 5 objective mission with 1 in the middle and 1 in each table quarter. An additional 2 points if you hold the center objective and the objective in your opponent's deployment zone. Holding the center objective, very easy. It's like 6 inches away from your deployment zone, and a lot of the dynamic in Sweep and Clear tends to be players running stuff into the middle in order to clear out the opponents, not only to stop them scoring primary, but also to score their own direct assault. It basically does what it says on the tin. You have to assault your opponent's army directly, and when you do that, you get 3 victory points. If you do that all 5 rounds, you get 15. That's easy. Not quite as easy as our number 1 pick here, though. This is probably the best secondary in Warhammer 40k. I'm not even just going to say GT2021. I don't think there will be any format of Warhammer 40k with an easier secondary than priority targets from the priority target mission. This one lets you pick an objective on your side of the table, typically in your deployment zone, and you score 3 victory points for holding it at the end of your turn. You can get some bonus victory points from holding your opponent's priority target objective, but I mean, that doesn't matter because there is almost no situation in which you won't be holding your own objective in your own deployment zone at the end of your turn every single round of the game. This is basically pick it and get 15 free victory points automatically. It's so easy. It's ridiculous. That's compounded by the fact that you can actually move the objectives around before you select which one is your priority target's objective, which means that you could potentially put it in a ridiculously defensible position where it's almost inconceivable that you'd ever lose it. This objective is actually complained about pretty often for being super duper easy. Basically an auto include anytime you're playing the priority target's mission, and tends to make the mission relatively boring because both armies will just hunker down on their own objective, score 10 primary victory points and 3 secondary points automatically every turn, and then try to score out the rest of their game plan from there. So yeah, basically, if you have this secondary in the lineup, always take it every time. It's ridiculously good. And that's it. That's all of the best and worst secondaries in GT 2021 Warhammer 40k. I hope you found this video useful. And again, if you like these sort of tactics deep dives, I do a ton of them over on the Advanced Tactics series that you can get access to as a patron member or as a YouTube channel member. I want to throw a big thanks over to Captaincon for sponsoring the video again. I'm very excited for the convention, and I hope to see you all there. And obviously, a huge thanks to everyone who supports the channel. YouTube channel members, patrons, Twitch subscribers, all those people are phenomenal, and I love them very much. Thanks so much for the support. Remember to keep it classy, folks, and have happy wargaming.